In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about photosynthesis. A lot of people think that photosynthesis is the way plants make energy, or ATP. And while photosynthesis does make some ATP, all of the ATP that's made in photosynthesis is also used in photosynthesis. So in reality, what the main purpose of photosynthesis is to make sugar or glucose, like we see here, for cellular respiration. But nevertheless, let's talk a little bit about photosynthesis. This is really the big picture, and if we can understand everything that's going on here, we know all that we need to know for photosynthesis. But let's break it down a little bit further and make sure that we know all the cell parts. First of all, this thing is a chloroplast. But within our chloroplast, we'd also have to remember that the chloroplast, is inside of a plant cell. So just this thing right here would be the chloroplast, and the chloroplast has a few different parts to it. This first part right here is called a thylakoid. Kind of looks like a pancake or a flattened pancake. This is where all the light reactions take place. If we have a stack of thylakoids, it's called a grana, a granum. And then if we have a whole bunch, so there's a granum, there's a granum, there's a granum, here's a granum, all of those collectively would be grana. Then all of this space, anything that's not part of a thylakoid but is still on the inside of a chloroplast, is a stroma. Photosynthesis is broken up into two parts: the light reactions that take place on the thylakoids, and the Calvin cycle, or the dark reactions that take place out here inside of the stroma. The other thing that we need to know is that here we're still dealing with things that need to carry electrons and hydrogen. In photosynthesis, we have NADP+, that is going to take electrons and hydrogens from different reactions to make NADPH. And the way that I always remember this, and the difference between NAD plus and NADP plus, is photosynthesis starts with the P. And in photosynthesis, we have NADP plus and NADPH. The last thing, a couple more things, is photo in photosynthesis. Well, photo means light. All right, so the other thing is on these thylakoids there's different pigments on here. And pigments are what absorbs light. So the sunlight that's going to shine down on these plant cells and in these chloroplasts, the light is captured and are absorbed by pigments. The main pigment for plants and chloroplasts is called chlorophyll. And there's different types of chlorophyll, but right now if we know that chlorophyll is the main type of pigment that absorbs lights for plants, we're pretty good to go. So what is light exactly? Well, we all know that we have a sun on our planet, and that sun emits light. Okay, we all know that, but what we may not all know is that the light that comes out comes in different wavelengths. So here would be the length of a wave. Some more light might be really short, so obviously that would be, this right here would be a shorter wavelength than this light right here. And those wavelengths are actually pretty important. As you see up here, we have radio waves that are really long, that's like 1,000 meters. Microwaves are much smaller. Infrared waves are even smaller, and our visible light is super duper tiny and small wavelengths. And then we get down to X-rays and gamma rays. So to put this in a little bit different perspective, All of this is different light that has different wavelengths to it. And humans can only see this spectrum right here. So even though we see the colors of the rainbow, in reality, it's just this teeny tiny amount of wavelengths that we can actually see. Remember how we said a moment ago that we have pigments that absorb light, and the main pigment for photosynthesis was chlorophyll. Well, there's different types of pigments as well, and each pigment has its own wavelength. So we'll have one pigment to pick up a wavelength at 700, another pigment for 690 nanometers of wavelength, another pigment for 670 nanometers of wavelength, so on and so forth. Each wavelength will have its own pigment. Now, there's not a whole heck of a lot of plants that have green pigment. That's the reason why we see most plants as green. It's because they don't absorb that light, but rather they reflect the wavelength that's at that green light. There's no pigments to absorb it, so they reflect that wavelength of light. So we see plants as green. So before we said photosynthesis is broken down into the light reactions and the dark reactions. So here we're going to talk a little bit about the light reactions. So light's going to come in and it's going to hit a pigment. So see, we have a pigment here. So light's going to come down and hit it. The other thing that happens is we split water. So water goes into the reaction, and as you see, oxygen comes out. We have some hydrogen that's going to come over here, and we'll deal with that in a moment. And maybe on another pigment, some more light comes down and hits this pigment. And with this guy, we're going to take NAD plus is going to go into this reaction, and NADPH comes in. Notice we have the electrons go in here and the hydrogen goes in here. So this NAD plus is stealing the electrons and hydrogens to make NADPH. These hydrogens that were made, and we're going to have a whole bunch of hydrogens over here, and we're going to go through, the hydrogen ions are going to go through the ATP synthase complex, causing the ATP synthase complex to spin. When the ATP synthase complex is spinning, it's going to take ADP and a phosphate to make ATP. And this hydrogen is going to come over here, like we said before, to combine with the electrons and have the NADP plus make NADPH. So the big things is in the light reactions, we made NADPH and ATP. Water came in, oxygen came out. And we have our light that's providing the power for all of this work to happen. The NADPH and the ATP are now going to go over to the dark reactions. The dark reactions are also known as the Calvin cycle. So all this guy is the Calvin cycle, or the dark reactions. And what happens is we have, here's a carbon dioxide, so one carbon molecule, will join up with a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbon molecule. Those combine, and it combines into a 6 carbon molecule, but it's really unstable. So what happens is the 6 carbon molecule splits up into 1, 2, 3 carbon molecules, and a whole bunch of chemical reactions are happening. As we see, ATP is being used, so ADP is left over. NADPH is being used, so NADP plus is left over. Here's another ATP being used, leaving ADP behind. And down here at the bottom of the cycle, we have this thing called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, which is G3P. This G3P is actually going to come out of the Calvin cycle, one of them anyways. The rest of the carbon molecules that are in here are going to regenerate themselves, and again we have this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbon molecule that's left that's going to regenerate and wait for the next carbon dioxide to come in and wait for another turn of the Calvin cycle. So we have this G3P that's down here. When the next turn of the Calvin cycle comes around, we're going to get another G3P. And when we add these two G3Ps together, those are going to make glucose, which is the goal of photosynthesis. Now this glucose is going to go and be used in cellular respiration to make all the ATP for the plant, for whatever it needs to do. Now, some of you may be looking at all of this and saying, well, the math doesn't add up. We had 6 carbons here and 3 came out. How do we have 5 here? Well, I'm not going to explain everything in detail, but just know that it takes 3 of these carbon dioxides in order to get 1 G3P out. Pause it and do the math if you like. Trust me, I promise it'll all work out. So finally, the big picture, the nuts and bolts of photosynthesis. Here's what we got going on. We're going to have light that comes down and hits the thylakoids. Obviously, right now we're talking about the light reactions. In these light reactions, the light that comes down, it's going to hit chlorophyll, which is a pigment that absorbs the light. Water is going to go into those light reactions and oxygen comes out. With all of these reactions happening, we're making ATP and NADPH. Those guys are going to go over to the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle happens in the stroma, or the middle of the chloroplast. Carbon dioxide is going to go into the Calvin cycle. And eventually we're going to need to make some stuff, but ATP and NADPH are what drives or what fuels or provides the energy for the Calvin cycle to take this carbon dioxide to make sugar. What we have left over after we use the ATP and the NADPH becomes NADP plus, and the ATP will become ADP. So water goes into the light reactions with light. Oxygen comes out along with the energy to provide and fuel the Calvin cycle. Carbon dioxide goes into the Calvin cycle. Glucose eventually will come out. The leftover parts of NADP plus and ADP will go back to the light reactions to fuel more light reactions to provide the energy for more of the Calvin cycle to make more glucose. Now we have the glucose made, so the plant can go through cellular respiration to make as much ATP that it can. Remember at the beginning I said that yes, it is true that photosynthesis does make ATP, but all the ATP that's used in that's made in photosynthesis also gets used by photosynthesis. So there is no net gain of ATP for photosynthesis. Plants take the glucose that it makes in photosynthesis and takes the glucose to cellular respiration to make all the ATP that it needs. I hope that was somewhat helpful, and this was photosynthesis. And that is all she wrote.
It's like this and like that and like this and it's like that and like this and like that and it's like this. So just chill till the next episode.